So positivism, this idea that our research and knowledge must be rooted in logic, empirical evidence. Is it important to have empirical evidence, data, and research? Yes. But can that be the only foundation for how we understand psychology, mental health, and human behavior? No.
This is why bad ideas never die in the psychological field. This is how we end up with nonsense like lived experience. To Psychobabble, where we expose bad therapy and the liberal narratives that contribute to our poor mental health. I'm Hannah Spear. Before we dive in, please support my work by liking and subscribing and sharing. If you become a member, a Psychobabble insider, by going to our website hannahspear.substack.com and subscribing there, choosing a subscription option. Then you can join us in the Psychobabble Insider members exclusive segment at the end of this, where we'll be talking about internal family systems and my take on that. So Psychobabble was always about how the psychological community is contributing to us becoming more psychologically unwell, and my colleagues' unconcern with the duration of therapy and how many patients are on our lists. And now I'm going to lay out the background, why that came to be and why psychology isn't correcting itself. Last year, I helped out a friend of mine, and she studies psychology as an undergrad at King's College in London. But I was absolutely shocked when I read the essay question. Focusing on either personality or intelligence, evaluate the research literature on sex differences and or gender differences with a view to outlining how evidence for any such differences can be treated to foster a more inclusive and equitable society. As you can see, the question was never to investigate whether differences exist or what the evidence shows. It was simply assumed that sex and gender are separate concepts and that the role of psychology was to promote inclusivity. I sent her solid cross-cultural studies on sexual differences in personality, but it didn't matter because any citation older than 10 years old was simply disallowed. So that meant any study she used for this essay, which took more than a month to finish, that was the sole focus for a large part of that semester, were all studies that saw sexual differences and gender through a purely ideological lens. I used to love psychiatry, and once again I was left feeling disappointed in this field. Why aren't more people concerned or asking why so many psychological approaches we use now fail to have the intended effect? Why aren't we more concerned with our role in why the psychiatric burden of disease keeps on rising? Once upon a time, until the mid-20th century, psychology at least tried to approximate a science. Some say that was always a pipe dream, but at least it used to follow the positivist paradigm. This is where we seek objective truths through quantifiable empirical research. Pioneers like Skinner and Piaget, they might have had their troubles, they might have had their biases, but they at least tried to quantify and adhere to data. Even though their theories might have been flawed, their approach assumed that human behavior could be measured and analyzed. But somehow, over the past few decades, we have shifted from attempting this to becoming a field of relativism, identity-based theories, and subjectivity. Instead of building on cumulative science, many psychology programs have pivoted to questioning and reinterpreting all the past findings through an ideological lens. Like in this student's case at King's College, the curriculum didn't engage with the decades of biological and cross-cultural research on gender differences. It skipped straight to recent theorists who assume differences must be socially constructed. And this reflects a broader trend. Older research, no matter how well replicated or cross-culturally verified, is often excluded or downplayed if it conflicts with the new ideological narratives. Professors label earlier studies as outdated, Western-based, or even dangerous, implying that objective findings can be disregarded if they don't fit the prevailing worldview. And what is the prevailing worldview, you might ask? It's a set of beliefs about society and power. And that has not only seeped into the psychological science, but a lot of it stems from it. They often start with conclusions like gender is purely a social construct, or traditional family structures are pathological, and then they work their way backwards rather than looking at quantifiable data first. And this has its roots in the broader intellectual trend in the 20th century that question whether science at all could be objective. I think the turning point can be traced back to postmodernism. And I know that term has become a buzzword lately, but in essence, postmodernism challenges the idea of the existence of an objective truth. It says that everything can be socially constructed. All truths are just narratives shaped by power. And in the context of psychology, they ask, is there really a stable, objective human nature that we can study, that we can discover? Or are psychologists just telling stories influenced by cultural biases? And in the 20th century, several thinkers drove these ideas into the heart of social sciences. You had Michel Foucault, whose work implied that psychological categories like diagnoses, like notions of madness or sexuality are not objective facts, but social inventions used to control people. He said knowledge is power, and he planted a seed of doubt into the entire enterprise of psychological science. And from that, a new generation of therapists ran with a new approach called narrative therapy. And it states that it emerged from postmodern, post-structuralist discourses that challenge and force re-evaluation of humanism and traditional psychology. And their founders, Michael White and David Epstein, admit that their work was influenced by Michel Foucault. And narrative therapy doesn't hide this fact. It's built on deconstructing the therapist's authority and treating the patient's personal story as the truth.
And the theory that I use is narrative theory, and I love it. And I think that part of the reason that it works so well with me and the work that I do is that I'm dyslexic. And as a dyslexic person, a lot of the thinking that I do is in story. And narrative theory is all about this kind of long, continuous story that has taught you who you are. And one of the parts of narrative theory that I really love is that narrative theory, when you actually break it down to how it understands the process of therapy, sees the therapeutic process as one continuous conversation. So it's not like there are all of these individually separate sessions. It's one long conversation that occurs at different points that's always building out this bigger picture. And that's so incredibly engaging and interesting when you look at it that way, because you start to see how everything kind of lines up. But also, I think that fits really well with who we are as people, because everything that we experience in our lives informs how we act, how we behave, how we think about ourselves. And narrative theory is all about looking at those things, interacting with, engaging with them in a way that's trying to figure out, okay, based on who you are, based on what you've experienced, based on what you believe about yourself, how do you want to use that information to inform the way that you can move forward in the way that's healthiest for you, and the way that's going to get you to where you want to go, and kind of continue writing out this story that you're already a part of, that you're already the main character of.
Then we have the influence of Judith Butler, whose gender theories permeated the psychology programs. She talks about gender performity, that gender isn't an inborn truth, but rather an act that we all put on. And she called on society to create. Then we have the influence of Judith Butler, whose gender theories permeated the psychology programs. She talks about gender performity, that gender isn't an inborn truth, but rather an act that we all put on. And she called on society to create gender trouble by disrupting the binary view of sex and gender. So, of course, psychology students are going to read this and then learn to be suspicious of any study that might suggest that there are inherent biological differences. The framework comes first, and the actual science is filtered through this lens. Then we have Kenneth Gergen. He started the social constructionist movement within psychology. He began arguing that everything in psychology, emotions, personality, even the concept of self, is not discovered but made by social discourse. In his paper in 1985, he essentially said that all our theories are just stories we tell, tied to culture and language. And these ideas caught on. Whole subfields were created, like critical psychology and discursive psychology, and they aimed to find out how psychological facts are socially constructed. By the 1990s, you had mainstream psychological conferences debating not how to improve experimental methods, but whether experiments were even valid, or just oppressive tools of a Eurocentric patriarchy. Why even learn about established cognitive theories or universal stages of development if nothing is universal? And it's all relative to culture and language. We see the influence of relativism very clearly in academic institutions. I mean, if you go into Cambridge University, which is a leading authority amongst psychology education, they openly embrace this by stating no view in psychology is definite. What happens then is that if no view is definite, then contradictory theories can coexist indefinitely, no matter how unscientific they may be. This is why bad ideas never die in the psychological field. This is why Freud's thoroughly debunked theories, like repressed memories, are still taught in psychological programs, alongside behavioral neuroscience and cognitive psychology, as though all theories are equally valid. And if you go through the prominent figures in psychology departments across these major universities, if you go and look at what they've authored and what they support, many openly question objectivity itself, and they decide on the coursework what students should concentrate on. Like this friend of mine spending more than a month of a semester on an essay that had just precluded that sex and gender are two different concepts. If you take a look at MIT's introductory psychology course, they focus on effective forecasting in their first lessons, teaching that the mind is inherently flawed instead of evolved for survival. Many programs emphasize how people construct meaning in their lives rather than studying measurable psychological processes. If you look at syllabi, you can find Kenneth Gergen, Judith Butler, and Michel Foucault referenced. You find narrative therapy and feminist theory, and you can increasingly find decolonizing psychology, which of course promotes the idea that Western society, Western psychology is inherently oppressive, and it advocates the replacement with indigenous ways of knowing.
In our continuation of the Liberation Psychology series, we're going to talk about why Martine Barreau, the founder of Liberation Psychology, critiqued so heavily this Eurocentric psychology and mental health framework. So we're going to break down why Eurocentric psychology is rooted in what is called a colonial epistemology. So a colonial epistemology is essentially this idea that which bodies of knowledge do we consider worthy, and a colonial epistemology is a body of knowledge that is only worthy under a white-centered, colonial, dominant narrative type of understanding. So what we see value in a Eurocentered framework is individualism, positivism, and universalism. So positivism, this idea that our research and knowledge must be rooted in logic, empirical evidence. Is it important to have empirical evidence, data, and research? Yes. But can that be the only foundation for how we understand psychology, mental health, and human behavior? No. Individualism. This is very easy. A Eurocentric psychology framework sees the individual as the center of their experience and does not see us as interconnected within a collective or within a larger scope of living systems. Lastly, universalism, which we see a lot in a Eurocentric psychology framework, which is that our human behaviors, experiences, thoughts, feelings, diagnoses, mental health issues, all can be categorized under one singular experience.
I don't have the sense that these people take the fact that we have to define mental disorders and actually diagnose mental disorders seriously. Because in order to do that, there has to be a certain objectivity available. But since we have completely disregarded standards, diagnosis now depends more on therapists' subjective interpretations and patients' subjective interpretations rather than standardized criteria, as we see in the definition of a traumatic event. And this contributes to our overdiagnosing and misdiagnosing, which in turn leads to mistreatment. This is how we end up with nonsense like lived experience. In this shift towards subjectivism in psychology, they started including qualitative research, and that relies on interviews and case studies, and it allows findings to be, or data to be, based on narratives. And the thing with qualitative research is that it allows unfalsifiable conclusions. And for something to be called science, you have to start with a hypothesis that someone else can be able to disprove. That's the whole point. And this increasing inclusion of qualitative research is a deliberate move by postmodernist relativists. It allows for their socially constructed view of reality, where findings rely on subjective interpretations rather than measurable outcomes. They make bad theories harder to disprove, and that leaves psychology wide open for ideological activism. For example, you might have heard of the concept of conscious bias. It's the concept that we all carry hidden prejudices in us. And the implicit association test, the IAT, it says to measure subtle prejudices by how quickly you react to words being said, how fast you associate concepts, like, for example, linking male with career. And this was applauded as revolutionary insight into racism and sexism. Unconscious bias lurks in all of us. And we all have seen how organizations and universities just ran with this. And the American Psychological Association still advocates it, promotes it. We think we can finally understand discrimination. And now it doesn't matter anymore that repeated studies find that a person's IAT score can't reliably predict their behavior, or that it leads to real-world discrimination, let alone that they can't replicate the same result twice, not even in the same person. As early as in 2005, some people carefully said, there's no evidence links a person's performance on the test with behavior. But the psychological community ran with this before the evidence was in. Until this day, people are still sent to diversity trainings based on this test. It's ideology that keeps it alive. Ideology from a field that once hoped to be taken seriously as a science, because the idea fits with the ideological idea that there's prejudice everywhere, and the prejudice is malicious and out to get power, not a bias that is meant to keep us alive, that we categorize the information we get in order to interpret it to our benefit. Instead, the thinking is more, well, the theory must be true, but the tool is flawed. We just haven't found the right tool yet. So why does the APA and many psychologists still promote it, because within this ideological bubble, acknowledging that implicit bias workshops don't work undermine the comforting notion that we are doing something good to fight prejudice. They have their own hero's journey, story, and they don't care about the individual patients sitting in our therapy rooms. Another idea that just won't die is the self-esteem concept that you'll even now find in the regularly used questionnaires. It's the perfect example of psychology clinging to a discredited idea. I mean, let me ask you this. If a surgeon would still be performing open surgery on something that is routinely done by laparoscopic surgery, would he still be practicing? Would he still have his license? Would patients still go to him? No, it somehow self-corrects. So why doesn't psychology? In the 80s and the 90s, psychologists pushed the idea that high self-esteem was the key to academic success and even crime prevention. California even launched a state-funded task force on self-esteem, even though research very soon showed that self-esteem doesn't cause better outcomes, that self-esteem as a concept wasn't something that we could quantify, that self-esteem is better explained, what we understand as self-esteem is better explained with the personality traits, with the big five, which is replicatable. And even meta-analysis, including this study here from Baumeister, found that artificially boosting self-esteem does very little to improve performance or behavior. But despite all of this, entire educational and therapeutic programs are still dedicated to this bogus concept, self-esteem, raising self-esteem. And it'll surprise most people to hear that this isn't scientifically grounded. And this has direct consequences in the therapy room. An ideologically driven therapist can spend hours with a patient validating their sense of victimhood without ever looking into cognitive distortions or cognitive behavioral coping strategies or checking for medical issues. Because of course you're anxious and depressed, you're experiencing systemic racism everywhere or microaggression. This is exactly how we get affirmation-only care, where any teen questioned in a gender clinic is fast-tracked to transition without examining other possibilities. And we know this because now we're hearing reports from people who later detransition who say they felt pressured. They feel the psychologists failed them by not exploring other issues, because we're educating clinicians who are terrified of not seeming woke. And this is because psychology has let something happen: ideological conformity and groupthink. We have a huge problem with a viewpoint diversity, lack thereof. When everyone in your professional circle thinks alike, faulty concepts like the ones I just mentioned are kept alive. They go unchallenged. We saw this in 2015. There was a massive replication effort done that showed that among 100 high-profile psychology studies, only 36% of these could be successfully replicated. And sure, every scientific field has replication problems. That's well known. But the specific problem in psychology, I think, is that students aren't aware of this. And this, I listened to an interview with Peter Boghossian. He's a well-known philosopher and a critic of postmodernist influence in academia. And he had once asked a class of psychology students whether they had ever heard of the replication crisis. And not one of them raised their hand. And so how are we going to fix a credibility problem when no one knows about it? And this is a very old problem. I read an article from 1939 by Richard Feynman. He noted exactly this problem back then. He had a conversation with a psychology student, and she wanted to test whether modifying an experimental condition would change her outcome. And she wanted to ask him advice on how to do that. And so he told her in detail how to do it correctly, this was a question about how she could replicate a finding that she had found interesting. And so he explained, and she got really excited, and she went to her professor and said, I wanted to do this. And he had told her, no, that would be a waste of time. You should do something new. And so this is partly the reason why bad ideas never die or never corrected. So one part is the postmodernist way of thinking. Another is that there's no diversity, there's no viewpoint diversity, as Jonathan Haidt pointed out, that such a large majority of psychologists are liberals, hold liberal views, and not just that, they find conservative views morally bad. So this was a 2012 survey of 500 psychologists, social psychologists. They found that 85% identified as liberal and only 6% as conservative. That's a left to right ratio of 14-1. And Jonathan Haidt he was at a major conference of psychologists, and he asked a show of hands who's a conservative, and only 3 out of 1,000 raised their hands. And not just that, 37.5% of psychologists who answered admitted they would be willing to discriminate against a conservative psychologist in hiring decisions. I mean, let that sink in. If you don't toe the ideological line, we won't hire you. The third factor is the APA. The American Psychological Association is a leading voice in mental health. And not just that, it's the gatekeeper for psychology licenses. Most states require APA accredited courses, internships, ethics exams, and even after licensure, they require this. The APA, it controls continuing education, and not just in the US. European universities follow their guidelines as well. And here's the thing, since the 19th century, the APA has been a political actor openly. They weigh in on issues from criminal justice to immigration, and they downplay research that don't play with their ideological narrative. And how would that even come to be when 6% of psychologists are conservative? So the APA still promotes the implicit bias association test, microaggressions. In 2019, the APA released guidelines for treating men and boys that controversially declared traditional masculinity as largely harmful, and it pathologized traits like stoicism and competitiveness, ambition. And in 2021, the APA issued this high-profile apology for their role in systemic racism, and they pledged to embed anti-racist strategies in everything going forward. So in effect, the largest psychology organization in the world with huge backing declared that it's not just a scientific body, it's an agent of socio-political change. How's that gonna go? All of this has a direct effect on why people spend too much time in therapy, why they're not getting well, especially after this is sold in reel after reel on social media. Why, for example, are we still seeing this concept of self-love? It helps no one. We know neuroscientifically, it has been repeatedly proven that consistent effort, small incremental changes lead to lasting self-improvement, betterment. That is, studies on habit formation, goal setting show that if you challenge yourself every day, a little bit, small steps, it's very boring, I know, but that does lead to a measurable psychological and neurological growth. But for postmodernists, this just will not do. They think that self-improvement implies a hierarchy where you tomorrow is deemed better than you today. And the postmodern idea states that you deconstruct hierarchies because they're hierarchies of power, and that is bad, must be rejected. And self-improvement would also mean that you acknowledge that certain goals are objectively better. It would mean accepting an objective truth, which also is a faux pas in a framework where everything's relative. But I would really like to see the evidence that these hierarchies are what makes people ill, that the oppression through the hierarchies is what's making them feel bad. Where's the evidence for that? And to go even further, where's the evidence that we're getting better by dismantling these hierarchies? Because from where I'm sitting, it's only getting worse. And you're not treating people with the treatments based on these ideas. But still, modern psychologists tell suffering patients week after week, what is perfection? If you change the way you see perfection, then you won't need to change at all. This wouldn't be tolerated in any other field of science. If you go to a surgeon with appendicitis and you have appendicitis, you don't go and say, I have appendicitis, you puke and you can't think for all the pain that you're in. And he would tell you, reframe your narrative. Instead of scheduling you for an appendectomy, you'd be in serious trouble. You wouldn't run because you couldn't run, but he would most definitely get fired. But when I told my supervisors, who were psychologists, when I did my degree in cognitive behavioral therapy, I told them this isn't working. They're not getting better. They told me, trust the process. But the thing is, we'll not be able to treat people unless we move away from this obsession with subjectivity. If we don't start arresting unfalsifiable ideas, stop including all the qualitative research or the hostile peer reviewers. The problem is much bigger than social media or overprescription of medication. It's this shift towards subjectivism and this dominion of unfalsifiable ideas. It's that we have left the field completely open to be manipulated by political and ideologically possessed actors who have very little regard for humankind. And I would say sometimes even show disdain for it. And that concludes the free episode of Psychobabble. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for the support. Thank you for liking and leaving a comment, let me know. And if you can, upgrade and become a Psychobabble insider, and we will go on to talk about internal family systems. If not, then have a nice day, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
I just finished an IFS therapy session, internal family systems. And oh my gosh, mind blown, so profound. So as a psychotherapist myself, I'm always dipping in and out of therapy because the healing journey never ends. It never ends. It's ongoing.
And this is where also not just IFS, but the therapy culture more broadly go completely off the rails.